I'd always wondered how I'd react if I'd ever lived through an earthquake. And I found out in a pretty spectacular way on the 19th of September 2017. For those in the know, that's when Mexico City, at least, and lots of parts of Mexico lived through a massive earthquake, one of the biggest in decades, killed quite a few people and wrought havoc across the city. I was sitting at my desk back when I was a book publisher, and it was incredible because one always thinks, like, what will I do if I ever get mugged at gunpoint? What will I ever do if I'm ever in a riot? That sort of thing. What will I ever do if there's an earthquake, a massive earthquake? And it turns out instinct really kicks in. The whole place started shaking, and before I even knew what was happening, I was up and telling everyone in the office to get out. We were at the top floor, and running down the stairs, you could see how everyone reacted differently. It was crazy. The most annoying person was a man who blocked the stairs with his whole body, stopping anyone from going down, and started shouting, "The phones! Get the phones!" And we pushed past him because he was clearly not going to let anyone past until we all went back and got his phones, which we didn't, of course. And we all ran out. And then it was a weird earthquake because it started shaking really violently at first. And then it was like the ground became like liquid, basically. And so the last few steps towards the final gate to get out of the building, it felt like I was drunk, like I could barely walk. And I sort of struggled out of the building, and it was just insane. And the funny, or not the funny thing, the terrible thing is that my office back then was in El Pedregal, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in a bit, which is the lava flows, the ancient lava flows in the south of Mexico City that actually stop a lot of the earthquake from coming through and being felt. Further north in the city, it was just complete chaos, especially the buildings built on the old lake bed. We'll talk more about the geology of Mexico and earthquakes, but it was just an insane day. And basically the rest of the day was just spent walking. We walked with basically the rest of the city because it was collapsed, like literally and in terms of infrastructure. And I walked from the south to the north of the city just looking for collapsed buildings, because that's kind of what people from Mexico City do. When these crises happen, people go out into the streets and like ants, they just go around randomly finding places where they can be of help, and then they help. And for the next, I think it was like 10 hours or something, I moved rubble. I felt pretty useless, but also pretty useful at the same time, like an ant, because they just line you up in a line and you just move rubble for hours. You don't know what's happening. And it was pretty horrible because at first you move concrete, then you start moving bricks, and then you start getting toys and clothes and shoes. And you just stand there for hours and you watch the doctors go by. You watch the people with motorcycles turn the lights on as the sky got dark. And then the most sort of like important thing, I think, to Mexicans at the time was a procedure, which is a procedure to listen under the rubble for noise, people calling for help, is the silence that they ask for. And the silence they ask for is a raised fist. And everyone raises their fist in silence. And it became an icon of the 2017 earthquake. And it became even more iconic after a couple of days later, Juan Villoro, probably Mexico City's best known and most famous writer. And he wrote a poem in the newspaper called Fist Held High. It was so emotive because it just described what everyone had been feeling for the past couple of days in such incredible detail. And it's called A Fist Held High because of that symbol that united Mexico City on that day.
That day, 19th September 2017, was extraordinary in so many ways. Yes, tragic. Thankfully, the loss of life is not particularly high, particularly compared to other earthquakes. But the loss of property, this is the patrimony of entire families, disappeared in a matter of minutes. So it was very sad on that front. But on the other front, it was a beautiful day because, as you say, Alex, people everywhere trying to help. I remember seeing, there were tens of thousands of people in every neighborhood of Mexico City that had been struck by the earthquake out to help. And it was a beautiful moment. I remember in the Doctores neighborhood, which is not a particularly rich, nor at least at the time, not a particularly safe neighborhood. You had people from all socioeconomic levels just put aside like the usual rules of where you go and where you don't go, and just show up to help. There was no doubt that we were all there to try our best to help in whatever way we could.
It's like the rules of engagement change and everything is on pause. I actually, at the end of the day, I was knackered and I was so far away from home and there was no transport to speak of. A guy saw me like trudging along and he just said, "Hey, do you want to get in my car? Like I'm going in that direction." And I did. I got in this stranger's car and he drove me home. It was crazy.
Which would never have happened usually.
Yeah, don't do that, kids. Don't get in a stranger's car. But it's just the rules of engagement change on a day like that.
And things get shaken up, one would say, when there are earthquakes.
Yeah. I mean, that's terrible. But it's weird because ultimately there is a weird suspicion and magic around that day specifically. It's insane how, I mean, I'm not an esoteric sort of person at all. I don't think there's any magic behind it. But there is something kind of creepy about the fact that the 19th of September is like Mexico's official earthquake day. The massive earthquake of 2017 happened just hours after Mexico City had its annual earthquake drill, where the city alarm goes off and people go out and do stuff. And people didn't really take it seriously. And then an hour later or something, the whole city came crashing down with a real earthquake. And the reason that day is the National Earthquake Drill Day is because decades before, actually 40 years from this year, in 1985, on the same day, slightly earlier in the day, a massive earthquake hit Mexico City as well. And it was crazy. And just to add sort of the creepiness to the day, a year later, in 2018, everyone took the earthquake drill really seriously. And we all went down, we all did what we were supposed to do, and we all came back. And literally 15 minutes after the drill, the alarm went off again, but this time for real. And an earthquake hit Mexico City, a much smaller one. But everyone was so upset by then. And I don't know if we're going to do this, Tavo. I don't think we should. But maybe, I mean, if we say there's a trigger warning before, we can. For those who don't know it, this is what the Mexico City alarm sounds like. If you're in Mexico City, turn your audio off because you'll scare a lot of people. And if you're from Mexico City, you'll probably be triggered by it. So turn your volume down for the next 5 seconds. Alerta sísmica. So that was that. That was the alarm, and I, for one, trembling just at the memory of it. It's a very Pavlovian reaction,
and it's really well designed. It's designed to sort of instill a certain measure of panic into people and get them moving out of the door. It's not just an alarm. It's supposed to egg people onto a particular behavior, and it does it really well, even without the associated trauma. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be going a little bit deeper into this topic of earthquakes in Mexico, not just the 2017 one, not just 1985, but how earthquakes affect daily life in Mexico, how that is linked to politics, and even the academic disciplines that Mexicans have focused on over the years. Mexico, or the land that we know as Mexico today, has always been affected not just by earthquakes, but by the tectonic plate movement that is the reason for earthquakes, of course. I think a wonderful example of that is possibly the greatest of all Mesoamerican cultures is the culture of Teotihuacan. The ruins of the Teotihuacan city are slightly north of Mexico City, and they belong or were built by a people who lived at the beginning of the Common Era, roughly from about 200 years before the Common Era to about 800 years after. But their golden age comes at around 350 of the Common Era. And that date coincides with a major volcanic eruption of the Xitle volcano that occurred in the center of the country and destroyed the only competition that Teotihuacan had at the time, the people of Cuicuilco. It created El Pedregal, this posh neighborhood in the southern part of the city, which Pedregal literally means where there are stones. These stones were
where
formed.
My office was.
Exactly. These stones were formed by the lava that arrived from this eruption. And you can actually visit the pyramid of Cuicuilco, or what is left of it, after it was destroyed by the volcano. So,
just to give a bit of context to people who don't know about these civilizations, the reason you should, they happened millennia ago, and yet they're so important to the history of Mexico, because Teotihuacan is really like the civilization. It's the civilization that the Aztecs, when they were wandering peoples, came across when they were arriving, or right before they arrived in Mexico City, and they thought it was a city made by gods because it was an enormous ruin by then, a city made of ruins that they said only gods could have created. That's what Teotihuacan means. It's the city of gods. And yet the reason Teotihuacan was able to get so big was because of this one tectonic event, this explosion of the volcano that destroyed their only competition, the only other superpower in Mesoamerica at the time. It's like if during the Cold War, suddenly America had disappeared and only the Soviet Union were left standing. Doesn't matter who was better out of the two, if you only have one superpower after the sudden collapse of one, like not like we saw the Soviet Union collapse after 1991, but like literally just the complete disappearance of that civilization and all its people. That's the sort of enormous event we're talking about.
But that, of course, was a very, very long time ago. Now, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions have continued to shape Mexican history, or the history of this region, because the geological reason for this to happen hasn't really changed. So the reason that Mexico has lots of earthquakes and why there's so much like volcanic activity, and there has been for such a long time, is because there are two very large tectonic plates that meet around Mexico. And more specifically, one of those plates is sort of sliding underneath the other one. The Cocos plate, as it's called, has been sliding for a long time beneath the much larger North American plate. And as it sort of slides slowly, these plates aren't, perfectly flat. There's little bumps in them. As they move and move over certain bumps, well, these are tectonic movements, right? There's a reason we say this. They're colossal movements, and they create ripple effects that we call earthquakes. This is happening all the time.
The importance of the positioning as well is crucial here for how Mexico City specifically deals with earthquakes. This contact point is a few hundred miles into the sea on the southern coast, Pacific coast of Mexico, just south of Oaxaca. And that is an important place for that tectonic plate to be, because it actually gives Mexico City a bit of time to react. Light travels faster than sound, and basically these ripples act a bit like sound. They go through the earth, so they move faster than what they do, than sound sounds like when it moves through the air, but it's still far slower than light. And so if you had sensors along the coast that detected that first impact of the ripples, then you can send, at light speed, a signal back to Mexico City that gives you about a minute and a half's advance warning before the earthquake hits. And that's basically the entire premise of Mexico City's seismic alarm. It's all these loudspeakers spread across the city, connected to the system that if you reach a certain threshold around, I think it's 6 on the Richter scale, the ripples hit the sensors, they send a message back to Mexico City, the alarm sounds, and everyone rushes out of buildings to avoid being crushed by them. Now, I've heard that this is very different from what happens in Japan, where you're encouraged to stay in your buildings. But in Mexico, there is no assurance that the building you're going to be in is going to be structurally stable enough. And that has a lot to do with construction and with corruption, with people skipping laws. And so a lot of the deaths that you saw in 2017 happened in buildings that had tried to skirt the construction rules.
Now, something that must be said is a minute and a half doesn't sound like much, but it is quite a bit. And the reason it is in some ways, or should be enough, is because you're actually supposed to do what they do in Japan. And if you are in a building that is structurally sound, as most buildings are, you don't need to rush out. You actually are not supposed to rush out, because the enormous majority of injuries that occur during an earthquake don't occur because the building fell down. It's very rare for buildings to actually fall down. Yes, it has happened. It happened in 1985, it happened in 2017, but usually it doesn't happen. The bulk of injuries occur because you might be standing next to a window, or you might be standing underneath a ledge. And what does happen all the time is that windows shatter, or bits and pieces of ledges fall down and hit you on the head.
Or if you work in a publishing house, massive books that turns out were strategically placed to collapse on you as you run out the door. Luckily, they fell after we'd left, but we definitely decided to move them after that earthquake.
Exactly. And this minute and a half is key to make sure people move towards the more solid parts of the building. I remember, for example, working in the Mexican Central Bank. I was very lucky to work in one of their more historic buildings, the Guardiola building, which is right next to the Palace of Fine Arts. It's a very old building, but it has a pretty good system with which it can take on the earthquakes. And what we would do, because the Mexican Central Bank does a really good job of training you through drills for the earthquake. When the alarm started, you had to move to like the center of the building, which is the most stable part of the building, and away from all the glass. Now, of course, people who lived in 1985 didn't necessarily follow protocol despite endless drills. I remember seeing a very relatively old man who'd lived the 85 earthquake and had seen one of the hospitals sort of collapse in front of him. Every time the alarm sounded, he would just sprint out of the building. I once saw him sprint through a Marine who was there to protect the central bank. And the Marine was trying to stop him, but this man was just like a panic response.
I guess
so yes.
One of the issues is, like, you never quite know what building you're in. You're a cultured man who knows exactly when the building was built and the mechanics behind its engineering, but most people don't. And so there is a sort of panicked response. But then again, the Bank of Mexico is based right in the heart of Mexico City's downtown area. And that's part of the city is just chock full of incredibly tall and, who knows, maybe dangerous buildings that have never quite collapsed. Can you explain that?
Yes, and this gets us to one of my favorite topics, particularly adjusted for how boring they are. It's definitely my most favorite topic. Civil engineering in Mexico. So actually, the biggest building in Mexico, the tallest building in Mexico until the early 1980s, sits in the historic downtown of Mexico, where many buildings have famously collapsed in earthquakes, most noticeably in 1985. This building was built in 1950, and in the 1950s, it was finished in 1956. And it's quite tall. It's like, I think it's 166 meters tall. It's not a lot compared to many buildings today, but it was a lot for Mexico in the 1950s and for a country and a city that lives a lot of earthquakes. And I think this opens like a very interesting chapter about Mexico, which is the level of prowess that Mexico has built around civil engineering and their knowledge of civil engineering. Yes, buildings do fall in Mexico because of corruption, but not because of poor engineering skills and knowledge. The Torre Latina is really interesting because it's the first time, I think, in all of Latin America that significant soil mechanics analyses are done before building a building. Now that's just standard practice. You don't build without soil mechanics analyses. But this was relatively novel. So soil mechanics starts as a discipline in the 1920s and 30s, like a weird thing that people did at university. It only really starts being used widely in the 40s and in very rich countries. So Mexico sort of was really pushing the boundaries of things by using soil mechanics in a not so rich country, A, and B, in a place that had a lot of earthquakes. And what's fascinating about the Torre Latina is it's built in 56. Everyone thinks it's not going to hold when there's a big earthquake. And in 1957, Mexico has one of its biggest earthquakes ever. And about 2:40 in the morning, I think it was, in 1957, there was a huge earthquake that actually toppled the Angel of Victory that sits atop the monument, the Independence Monument in Reforma. And next morning, the Torre Latina was still standing.
Unscathed.
Completely unscathed. And it's still there. It survived 85. It survived 2017. Now, part of the complexity around building stuff in Mexico City is, as you mentioned, Alex, that the city was built on where there used to be a lake. We've slowly drained that lake, but the soil underneath is still the one that belongs to a lake, and water still rains every year, colossal amounts, and the water still seeps through. So there's still a lake underneath. So, of course, when you build on top of this thing, it's not the most stable of places.
It turns out that Mexico City is actually a really bad place to build an enormous megalopolis because it's an old lake bed in a valley that actually captures water. So it's an inland sea, what you would see in Mexico City if there weren't a city. And it is in the middle of the path of all these volcanoes and earthquakes. And yet that's what makes it so fertile. That's what makes it so interesting and a worthwhile place to be and have agriculture and loads of civilizations. And yet the lake bed, now that it's been drained, is just such a difficult place to build. Mexico City's metro system is a feat of engineering. Lots of people laugh and they think it's a measure of its underdevelopment when they see Mexico City's metro being run on pneumatic wheels, like if it were a bus, basically, instead of, iron rails as you're used to. But actually, it makes perfect sense, because if you look down the long sort of like run of the metro, you can see that actually it's going up and down a bit like a roller coaster, because it turns out the ground is so unstable that it starts to bend and warp. And that's why you can see a lot of Mexico City sinking. But Mexico City's metro is still working half a century after it was inaugurated, because it's so well built. And it's also a really good place to be if there's ever an earthquake.
And it's one of these things that one doesn't ever think about, right? Like, civil engineering was really interesting maybe 200 years ago. Now we sort of take it for granted. But there are places like Mexico City, like Tokyo, where you really can't take it for granted, because the ground in which you're standing is literally changing dramatically all the time, right? So you need to be quite innovative in order to continue to live there and continue to build bigger and taller buildings every year.
But wait, so they built this massive skyscraper in 1956, and then why didn't they build any skyscrapers afterwards?
I mean, they did. So in the early 80s, they built the Pemex Tower. So I think it's 27 years that the Torre Latino is the tallest building in Mexico. And I think for quite some time in Latin America. And then the National Oil Company's executive building is built in Mexico City, and it's much taller. But then I think it's finished in 1984. And in 1985, you get the most destructive earthquake that Mexico has ever lived. Actually, that exists on record. Like, there were destructive earthquakes in the colonial period as well, but nothing like the 85 earthquake. And it wasn't just more destructive because it was particularly powerful. Yes, it was powerful, but there have been others like it. It was very destructive because of the corruption that you mentioned.
And what's fascinating to me is that it basically puts a complete halt to all skyscraper building for about 2 decades in Mexico. And it consolidates Mexico's reputation as this sprawling but low-level city with short, squat buildings just sprawling across this valley. Juan Villoro, who wrote that Fist Held High poem, actually has a great expression for it, which is when you're in Mexico City, you get horizontal vertigo because it's so sprawling and so flat.
Yes, definitely. I actually love that. But yes, you as you say, like, all construction of really tall buildings was completely stopped for 20 years. But in the early 2000s, there's a Canadian businessman who sort of comes in to break that taboo. And they build a new building called the Torre Mayor, which is over 200 meters tall, the first of its size in Mexico. It is the tallest building in Mexico at the time by a significant margin. And it's built right in the area where earthquakes hit, right? Like, you could have just built somewhere else where earthquakes are less prevalent, they can damage less. But they said, no, we can do this where it could be hurt and it'll be fine.
Just a quick note, the Torre Latino, that first one built in 1956, even though it was a great feat of civil engineering, it's also on that little island where the Aztecs had set up. So it's far more stable ground than the rest of Mexico City, which is the drained lake bed.
Exactly. But the Torre Mayor is still there. I worked there for several years, and yes, the earth were awful there, but the building doesn't fall, which is nice.
It's sort of meant to feel like that, right? It's meant to sort of sway with the earthquake, so you feel terrible, but it's actually turning that kinetic energy into controlled kinetic energy in the building rather than cracks and fissures all across the building.
Exactly. If you're in a tall building in a place that has earthquakes, and an earthquake starts and the building isn't moving back and forth, that's when you panic. If it's moving, you're fine. And just to end on this whole thing around civil engineering in Mexico, Mexico continues to be a constant innovator, and it continues to be an unusually relevant major player of the civil engineering world. In the 90s, for example, there's a thing invented that's called tridilosa, like 3D slab.
I didn't know that's what it meant.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea was that you could build something that could withstand things like earthquakes, but it would reduce concrete use by up to 90%. And lots of buildings in Mexico and in Mexico City and around the country are built with this tridilosa, which is basically sort of like pyramids made of little like steel sticks all like welded together and then surrounded by concrete. And that was a really big innovation. There's Cemex, for example, one of the largest cement companies and concrete companies in the world. It's not only one of the largest in revenue, but it is widely considered to be one of the most innovative, creating concrete solutions that allow for water to permeate better, concrete solutions that are made with much lower amounts of CO2, which is huge. And even the Puente Baluarte in more recent times, in 2012, this bridge is a cable-stayed bridge. This was the highest cable-stayed bridge in the world at the time. Now it's like number 3 or 4. That means that when you're in the middle of the bridge all the way, and then you look down all the way to the bottom, how many meters are there? Well, this was over 400 meters. And it was a true feat of engineering at the time.
One of my least fond memories with Tavo is dozing in a car as we drove towards Oaxaca along one of these cable-stayed bridges. And Tavo was kind enough to wake me up to look at the amazing view. But of course, I had no context, being asleep. And so I was awakened to what basically felt like falling into the abyss. And yes, I didn't appreciate the view as much as you thought.
To be fair, if you don't have the context, it is quite terrifying. But something that I take away from all of this and why I love this otherwise quite boring topic is when people talk of Mexico, they always talk or often talk about how many things don't work, how Mexico plays second fiddle, how Mexico needs to be better and less corrupt and so on. And often the good things are about, the beaches or something historical and cultural. And yes, those things are great. And yes, a lot of the things that we complain about do merit the complaints. But there are a few things that Mexico does exceptionally well and continues to do today. And civil engineering is one of them. So next time that you're driving on these extraordinary bridges or these extraordinary roads, driving to Oaxaca or driving from Durango to Mazatlan or from Mexico City to Acapulco, take a moment to take stock of these extraordinary feats of engineering that have existed for decades and continue to function in a country that has really complex terrain, that has earthquakes all the time, because it is a testament to prowess of Mexican civil engineering.
Arguably, you could say that even when things are pretty crap in Mexico, Mexicans are pretty good at turning that on its head and making it an interesting, if not outstanding and wonderful phenomenon to behold. I'd like to close up this talk about earthquakes in Mexico with an incredible story, which is based around that 1985 earthquake. And it's basically the story of how Mexican politics today, everything we know about the Mexican government today, is the way it is because of that one earthquake 40 years ago. So a bit of the context beyond the buildings and beyond the tectonic shifts underneath Mexicans' feet. The 1980s were still the heyday of the PRI, the one-party state that ran Mexico for most of the 20th century, as we all know. And by then, people were pretty sick of them. But no one was really doing much because a few years before, the government had shown that it was going to crack down on anyone who pushed back on them. And so people kind of stayed quiet. It's actually incredible to see all these massive 1960s semi-revolutionary movements coming up in Mexico, only to be completely crushed, most notably in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco, a neighborhood in Mexico City. And so the Mexican government stayed in place in relative stability until it was shaken up in 1985. And it was shaken up not by a new political party, but by the people who came out into the streets to move rubble and to save their loved ones as the buildings fell. And as we know, corruption is a big reason why these buildings fall, but also the government was just so inept at mobilizing help that the citizens had to do it themselves. It isn't an accident that Mexico City at the time was basically, it was a regency, they called it. There was no elected mayor. It was basically just the president who put the governor of Mexico City, and that person was often a military governor. And so it was just a government meant to keep the people in check, not to represent or govern for them. And so when the people stream out into the streets, they see that they are able to do everything the government's supposed to do and better. The army actually stood vigil as the citizens moved rubble because they didn't have instructions, because the government was in complete disarray on that day. But the citizens came out and organically saved each other's lives.
There's a beautiful thing of when you speak to most people who lived the 1985 earthquake and were above a certain age, everyone has a story of either them or someone very close to them being part of this mob that was helping move the rubble. My grandfather at the time, he worked at a company where they made a lot of machinery with like hydraulic equipment. And he basically just borrowed, let's call it, a bunch of that. I don't think they knew that he was borrowing it, but he didn't care. He just went and got all this machinery that could lift rubble in a substantial way, and just drove it down to downtown area where so many buildings had collapsed. And his story could be told by so many other people. Mexican citizens just came out and plugged the gap that the government left and that the government should have been dealing with.
And Mexicans have been like that ever since, right? I think you've heard stories and I've heard stories. We were part of a very similar dynamic in 2017, although because it was much less of a massive calamity, it was a sort of the less momentous political moment as well. But this was a massive deal back in Mexico during the age of the PRI. A few days after the earthquake, on the 24th of October, the people got together and they created the Coordinadora Única de Damnificados, which is more or less the Union of Earthquake Victims. And that organization was created to pressure the government into helping them get rid of the rubble and helping them rebuild. And it was centered, I don't know if accidentally or just because it was really badly hit by the earthquake, it was centered around the Tlatelolco housing estates, where the government had killed all those students a few decades before. And one of the most beautiful creations of this era, because people would march to the presidential palace and demand housing to be rebuilt. There were protests, there were sit-ins. It was a really, they used all the tools of protest available to them. They started supporting opposition political parties. But I think the most beautiful thing to come out of that was one man and the character he created. And his name, the character's name, was Superbarrio Gómez. Superbarrio Gómez is an incredible moment in Mexican history because it's like a cross between Superman and a luchador. He's got the mask, but he's got like a t-shirt with like a Superman emblem on his chest, but it says SB, and he's got a cape and he's all in red, and he's the guy who represents these poor people who've had their houses destroyed, and he fights earthquakes and bad government. And he became such
people from the barrio, right? He's super barrio.
Exactly right. And so this guy becomes their representative in more than one way. He ultimately runs for president in 1988, a very minor character. It's all done sort of in tongue-in-cheek, but it's a really important endorsement to get. And so when he does decline in favor of Cárdenas, who was the left-wing candidate and who had also been the mayor of Mexico City, the first democratically elected mayor, it was almost like the torch was being passed from these organizations, these civil society organizations, to a legitimately democratic government. And this, Tavo, I haven't even told you this because I want to see what you think about this incredible fact of history, which I didn't know at the time. He ran for Mexican president in 1988, but he doesn't give up on politics then. He then goes on in 1996 to run for the US presidency and gets endorsed by none other than Noam Chomsky.
No.
There's actually a photo of the two, and it's just like Noam Chomsky looking like Noam Chomsky, disheveled academic, and this short, fat, like it's so funny because part of his like whole thing was like he's got a nice beer belly, and Super Barrio standing next to him in all red, tight red t-shirt, luchador mask, and just an incredible moment. And the whole point is, everyone knows this guy's not going to win, but the whole point is to endorse a man, a figure who represents the spirit of collective civil society in the face of repressive government and in the face of terrible calamity. And it's one of those things, right? It's like Mexico City coming back like a phoenix from the ashes every time an earthquake wreaks havoc, and beautiful things like that emerged from Juan Villoro's poetry about the heroism of people, everyday people on that day, to the actual people who move the rubble and borrow equipment to move all the rubble away, to incredible political figures like Super Barrio Gomez.
I mean, Super Barrio Gomez, the hero we don't deserve, but the hero we need.
Absolutely. And with that, I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we'll be talking about Mexico, its history, economy, politics, earthquakes.
And everything that makes this wonderful, shaky country tick. Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist and give us a like, give us a comment, send us a letter. We'd love to hear from you. Till then, bye for now.